Hello, this is Head to Head on uatv, and I'm Oles Gerjuk. After the Syrian government's use of chemical weapons in its civil war, the United States holds responsible not just the government of President Bashar al-Assad, but also his patrons in Russian Federation and Iran. That is why the Trump administration plans to impose new sanctions against Russia. This is underscoring the deterioration in relations between Moscow and the West. To discuss the latest updates, we welcome to the studio Kirill Mikhailov, researcher at Conflict Intelligence Team. Hello, and thank you for being with us today, Mr. Mikhailov.
Thanks for having me.
So, how do you think, how far would Mr. Trump go in trying to shape the events in Syria?
It is actually really hard to tell how far Trump would go. On the one hand, he has behaved a lot more aggressively to Moscow than some people in Moscow perhaps expected right after he was elected. On the other hand, we are seeing those reports that he allegedly fumed at expelling Russian diplomats and stuff like that. But I think it should be asked not what Trump is prepared to do, but other factions in his administration. We should look at John Bolton, his new national security advisor, who is a big Russia hawk, and I think I would expect some really hard-hitting sanctions. If they would be talking about sanctioning those who actually enable the Assad regime offensives, we are talking the major Russian arms producers first. Uralvagonzavod that supplies the modern T-90 tanks to Assad and Iran militias, are Russian air companies like Sukhoi, who have supplied the jets that have bombed Syria, the Russian jets, and have probably refurbished the outdated Syrian jets that have also been bombed in Syria and that have dropped chemical weapons. And I think that would hit pretty hard because Russian arms exports are a big and a matter of prestige for Russia, and one of the major sources of the Russian budgetary income, which is already quite strained.
Well, also the American ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, has warned Syria that if it uses toxic gas against its people again, the U.S. is, quote, lock and loaded. Would they be ready to fire again, in your opinion?
It is actually the question of how those chemical attacks are perceived in the media. It's perhaps a little-known fact, and it's frankly appalling that it's such a little-known fact that since the Syrian attack in Khan Sheikhoun last year, which was met with a U.S. missile strike, and the recent attack in Douma, there have been literally dozens of lesser, minor chemical attacks that have injured dozens of people, but killed almost none. Everywhere. In Idlib, everywhere the Syrian army has been doing their offensives. It's now part and parcel of the Syrian army's offensives. For instance, to quote our colleagues at Bellingcat, there have been at least 5 of those chlorine attacks in Douma. The thing about chlorine, that unlike sarin, which is this nerve agent, chlorine, it does cause some major health issues, but generally people survive that.
But
the situation in Douma was that appalling that literally all medical facilities were out of operation and people were huddled in their homes, fearing the non-ceasing airstrikes, and that's what probably led to this massacre. And if another chemical attack happens and it isn't a massacre, if it does not get to the international media, if the Western coalition does not have to respond or either respond or lose face, that could continue. This low-scale chlorine use, which is actually very ad hoc, it's quite unlike sarin, which there is an industry. There is an industry that produces nerve agents, and the United States, France, and the UK have hit that. They've hit the research centers and sarin stockpiles, but
of course,
they have not hit the infrastructure to deliver chlorine, which is Assad's air bases like Douma and Meze around Damascus. And they haven't been hit, as far as we know, And those helicopters that very likely delivered that deadly chlorine cylinder, they will continue to operate, and they could deliver their deadly cargo everywhere in other areas where Assad will continue to put pressure on the remains of his opposition.
How do you think, why did this campaign to prevent the use of chemical weapons has started just now? If you say that chemical weapons have been in use for many years and in many places in Syria.
International media.
Just due to the public coverage?
Due to the coverage, which in turn came due to the very high death toll compared to other attacks.
Okay, so what could be the next steps to counter this policy, basically?
No one knows. The thing with the West, they do not have a workable strategy in Syria. I think this fixation on chemical weapons is probably good for the world in general. That would deter other would-be dictators and genociders from using chemical weapons.
So.
But I mean, it's just a part of Assad's arsenal and Russia's arsenal. That there are those deadly barrel bombs that are very indiscriminate. The Russian supplied and Russian launched cluster bombs, incendiary bombs, thermite bombs, so-called, and bunker busters, which are used to target underground hospitals. And this death machine is not targeted, and there is no credible policy to do that and to stop the carnage in Syria.
Well, for now, we see that France and the United Kingdom are the strongest allies of the US's attempts to prevent the next use of the chemical weapons. What about the rest of the European countries?
Well,
what's their reaction?
I think they are not that eager to engage militarily in the Middle East, perhaps because they have this kind of restrained policy, like take Germany, who they supported, just not militarily. That's what they said. And
that's their statement.
I think both France and the UK have some pretty good reasons to be there. Like France is reasserting itself as a power in the Middle East and North Africa under Macron as a global player, and the UK, of course, has recently certain, let's say, disagreements with Russia over chemical weapon use. I'm referring, of course, to the Skripal case. So I think the UK would have an incentive to respond.
Well, of course, now it's their policy to counter the use of chemical weapons after the Salisbury case.
Especially after the Salisbury case.
Yes, but you mentioned that Germany is not ready to help militarily, but then how?
I don't know. It really depends on the German internal politics, of which I'm not an expert of. But there is this big business lobby that actually kind of defines German policy towards Russia. We are looking at Nord Stream, this Siemens turbine gate. This all shows that there probably are some other special interests that could define German policy towards Russia.
So because of Russia, they wouldn't be willing to get involved into this conflict,
especially not militarily, and some analysts believe that the Bundeswehr is just unprepared for that right now.
Well, so far we know that Emmanuel Macron, the French president, has just stated that France allocates 50 million euros of humanitarian aid for Syria, and also the ministries of foreign affairs of the European Union held a joint discussion about the ongoing events recently. What are the outcomes of these kind of meetings of the ministries of foreign affairs?
This is a very important step. This stabilization aid, this rebuilding aid, is what is the only leverage that the Western countries, beyond those frankly unsustainable airstrikes, because they are not prepared to sustain them. So the biggest leverage they have on the situation in Syria, first of all, it can be used to rebuild the areas which were liberated with help of the Western coalition from ISIS, controlled by the so-called Syrian democratic forces, including Iraq, which was ISIS's former capital. And, you know, Macron's aid comes not a moment too soon, because literally, like last week, Trump actually he banned a proposal to allocate 200 million for the restoration of Raqqa and other parts that have been bombed by the Western coalition, by the way, during the liberation. So this aid is important because it builds a sustainable government in the absence of Assad regime. That it is another source, apart from Damascus, of returning to normalcy. And one interesting thing that Mogherini, the EU foreign person, has said that there is a precondition for humanitarian aid, and that's meaningful political dialogue in Syria. And it frankly looks at what they are seeing now in Syria, the Russian, Turkish, Iranian attempts to reconcile the situation in Astana, the near-dead UN process in Geneva. They are not seeing that as a meaningful political process. And that actually means that Assad at least preparing to step down. Because I think financing Syria's reconstruction under Assad is a big no-no for the West, and
of course,
this is one leverage that could still turn the situation in Syria. And there is actually a lot of money involved. Assad himself spoke of $400 billion in 10 to 15 years. And this is not something Russia and Iran are prepared to bankroll, of course, because all of them have their own problems. They have their economic protests, both Russia and Iran. And if they had the money to bomb Syria, they don't have this to rebuild it. So they will have to find Western aid. Actually, Putin called for the West to aid Syria, but here is where the interesting process starts, because this humanitarian aid, like I said, is the last leverage, and Macron is very wise to use it.
How do you think on these discussions of the ministries foreign affairs of the EU, what is the negotiation, what is the outcome out of it? Are there just talks about the humanitarian aid mostly, or
there is also the refugee issue, of course, because at some point those refugees will have to be resettled, and most of them want to be resettled. Most of them don't want to stay in Europe, which hasn't been the most welcoming for some of them. And this is actually what else they could be discussing is cutting a kind of a deal with Turkey, which has now secured safe buffer zone on the northwestern part of Syria, which is run under Turkish administration, and which you could kind of compare to eastern Ukraine, right? How it is being run right now. So that area could potentially accept Syrian refugees inside Syria from Europe and from the Middle East, which has been overburdened with refugees as it is. So that's probably another refugee deal with Turkey, something they could be cutting right now. It's just speculation. And of course there is the issue of the conditions for humanitarian aid and rebuilding aid for Syria.
Okay, now let's move to NATO's reaction. What's the reaction of the alliance, basically?
As I have heard of the statements, like Jens Stoltenberg and others, he says that every country supported it. I think he probably did not actually ask their opinion. I don't think
of the member countries, you mean?
I think probably he did, but I don't think some of them would voice them in in public because of the internal political issues. I'm talking of the eastern flank, like Greece and Bulgaria. But it's not that they would oppose those strikes or something, but they are perfectly happy to sit back and let this small coalition of the willing do their job, do what needs to be done. On the other hand, there has been a pronounced reaction from another NATO member, Turkey, that is. And this actually broke with their official token of alliance with Russia. And this was Turkey backed what is perceived by many as an anti-Russian move. And this could sow the seeds of discord in this Turkish-Russian-Iranian alliance.
Okay, and the very last question, because we are unfortunately running out of time. Days after the alleged chemical weapons attack, the United Nations Security Council failed to adopt a U.S. resolution that would have established a mechanism to investigate the use of chemical weapons in Syria. So Russia vetoed this idea, and overall Russia has used its veto privilege 12 times to block motions on Syria. So how can UN Security Council, what can UN Security Council do if Russia has this veto power, and are there any ways to deprive Russia of such a privilege?
I'm not a UN expert, but from what I've heard on UN experts, that the Security Council system is effectively very broken right now, because everything can be blocked, and it's not just Russia that does it. The US does it all the time on the Israel-Palestine question, even though all the other countries are for condemning Israel. So the thing is that they have heard different propositions, like making it that only 2 countries could veto, and it would be crucial because China has stopped backing Russia at some point in their Syrian resolutions, at least back in their vetoes. They did vote for the Russian resolution, but they didn't veto the US one.
Okay.
So what is clear, that this Security Council, which was formed like 60 or 70 years ago, is in desperate need for reform. Okay, well, thank you so much for this interesting conversation. That was Kirill Mikhailov, researcher at Conflict Intelligence Team. Thank you for watching Head to Head. I'm Oles Gerjuk. Goodbye.